In this industry, we want to say yes to everything and everybody. Ultimately, our leverage in terms of taking on what we deem as the right business is our ability to say no. Do we utilize technology to close those gaps, or do we utilize our people to close those gaps, or is it both? What it immediately does is monetizes U.S. residency. And that ultimately, to me, is a very slippery slope.
Hi, friends, and welcome to this episode of Now Hiring, the podcast about talent, staffing, and recruiting, brought to you by the good people at Siebel. I'm your host, Andy Weiss, Chief Marketing Officer at Siebel. Today's guest is Robert Bouchard, the COO of Tier4 Group. He's also known as the H1B Guy, and we'll be getting into that one. Robert and I also dive deep into what it takes to build a future-proof staffing firm, from balancing tech and a human touch to navigating immigration policy and even learning how to say no strategically. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Robert. Robert, welcome to Now Hiring.
Hey, Andy, thanks so much for having me and really excited about our conversation.
Awesome. Well, to help kick us off, why don't you share with us a little bit about Tier4? I know you guys recently were recognized as one of the Q4 rockstar recruiting firms, so congratulations on that. But why don't you share a bit about Tier4 for us?
Yeah, absolutely. We are a woman-owned and diversity certified staffing firm located in Alpharetta, Georgia. We do have what we like to call hubs throughout the East and Midwest, including here in Atlanta, Boston, DC, Central Florida, Milwaukee, Chicago, and our Dallas and Austin, Texas locations. We have been in business for a little over 11 years and was founded by Betsy Robinson, who is our CEO and president. I came to Tier4 starting in 2021 in what we like to call the post-pandemic emergence in staffing. And we've just been on a really wild ride, Andy, since then. We specialize primarily in technology, but some finance and accounting, administrative professional services, focusing primarily in financial services, insurance, supply chain, manufacturing, healthcare, and e-commerce and retail. And we have the saying where we like to say we love to blend and balance technology and automation with human touch.
So what is that? Let's unpack that. What does that mean?
Yeah. For those of us in the staffing industry, the last 5 years has really been what I would call an arms race in the tech space. We've seen really the evolution of generative AI, adaptive cognitive AI that has really taken over our space. And that means a lot of different things to a lot of different folks. But for us, what we like to think is it helps us create an opportunity to serve as a centralized point of contact. The applications that exist right now in the current market are, on average, we see anywhere between 3,000 to 4,000 applications a month across our postings. And if we look at what that means for a normal human recruiter, which on average can get through 150 to 200 of those a day, it's created a lot of bottlenecks and issues for us in identifying the best talent that's available, not only through the application process, but through general outreach and communication as well. We'd love to hire senior folks, Andy. And so what that allows us to do is bridge the gap with industry veterans, as well as some of the latest technology. And an organization like Tier4, where that's benefited us, is we've been able to be on the front or leading edge of adopting tech, or as we like to say, fail fast, learn faster. We've tried a lot of things that have worked, and we've gotten rid of a lot of things that haven't worked. So finding that balance, Andy, is what I really meant by the comment.
Okay, so walk me through that, if you will. Like, how do you talent and recruiting coming off the pandemic, things are exploding. You want to automate, you want to bring tech in there. What's the not an uncommon problem. But it sounds like you guys have cracked the nut a little bit. So um, what's that vetting process? Like, how do you decide what to bring in? Because you talked
Yeah.
about kind of the importance of the human component in
Hmm.
here. So where do you
Hmm.
bring the tech in? How do you evaluate it? What's that process been like for Tier 4?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for us, we started on this journey, I'll say 2.5 years ago at this point, and through word of mouth and a lot of research, reviewed and evaluated, I'll say about 100 different platforms that currently exist, not only in the ATS CRM space, but also in the AI and agentic space as well,
Okay.
and also platforms that create automations and connectivity between all of those entities. And what we did is we started out with a very small group within our team, where we brought to them the technology that we were giving really heavy consideration to, and asked for their thoughts and opinions,
Oh,
not only
okay.
to gain their buy-in, but also for them to help see and realize that this is not only investment in the business, but an investment in them, because we're all searching for more time, Andy. And the
Yeah.
beautiful thing about technology is, if leveraged correctly, can create opportunities to focus on outputs that create more results.
Hmm.
And that is something that we've really focused on, is creating buy-in amongst our team, which, when we've gone through the implementation phase, allows for buy-in past that.
Okay. So what was their initial reaction? Because it sounds like that was a little new to them.
Yeah. Um, I think the initial reaction is excitement, but how you envision this perfect utopia environment to exist and what happens in implementation are two different things
Yeah.
completely.
Yeah.
And so I think setting honest expectations that what currently exists is not perfect, but as
Hmm.
long as we're progressing, and really looking to get it right over time versus get it right the first time. So it is about trial and error and
Yeah.
iteration and figuring it out, which sometimes can be very frustrating for the team, and for us as leaders to go and say, this isn't right. Let's solution or reverse engineer backwards. And
Hmm.
then leveraging those that can advocate on our behalf to help move that, because our scenario is different than others that exist, and what our workflow needs to look like to create perfection for us may not be the case for others that are looking to do similar or the same types of things that we are. So I think ultimately you have to have champions within the team, that really creates buy-in amongst the rest of the group. And
Okay.
so we've identified what we call subject matter experts, or sort of pod leaders, that have helped us not only identify those gaps, but solve and create solutions for those.
So with the champions and or pod leaders, I have to imagine, you know, the rest of us listening to this conversation
Hmm.
and having myself been through other kind of tech evaluations, like
Hmm.
you want to bring, you know, the larger constituency into the process, but
Hmm.
then the risk is you have a lot of different voices,
Yeah.
and finding something, a
Hmm.
solution or an approach that answers every question, solves every need, as you
Hmm.
alluded to, kind of, it's, you know, that silver bullet does not exist.
It doesn't
So
exist.
did the champions or those pods kind of help quiet kind of the, or not quiet, but manage all the different voices and kind of the different groups or different kind
Hmm.
of needs, and kind of help you as an organization coalesce
Yeah.
behind, here's the direction that we ultimately need to go,
Hmm.
and the hows and whys?
Yeah, I think some of the things we've learned along the way is that it's okay to not have a clearly defined process and workflow, but working towards that progression that I mentioned earlier, and identifying what needs to become our best practice for our processes. Uh, we have to rely on the folks that are doing it day to day. And I am absolutely indebted to our leaders that have helped us get to the point that we are, and they know who they are. And without them, we wouldn't be where we currently are today, which is on this 2.5 year journey. We're 7-8 weeks into our tech transformation from post implementation go live. But what we've realized in this last 6 to 7, 8 weeks, Andy, is that it's okay if it isn't right today, but at future state, we want to be progressing towards getting it right. And I know that sounds repetitive, but it really comes back to a mindset of gaps are going to always exist. And our choice becomes, do we utilize technology to close those gaps, or do we utilize our people to close those gaps, or is it both? And we've taken the approach that a balance between the two is the key to what our future state as an organization looks like, not only in technology and staff augmentation, but just in the people and talent acquisition business as a whole.
Yeah, well, it has to help, I imagine, from not only the adoption, but also retention of your own staff. But then I saw on the Tier4 site that you guys have a 92% kind of placement ratio, success rate, where 92% of your candidates
it's a retention rate.
Get the job are there for at least 2 years after that. Yeah. So balancing that people side and being able to kind of have this path forward sounds like it's doing wonders for Tier4.
Yeah, and as you alluded to in terms of the certification, another thing that we are really excited about and brings validation to everything that we're talking about, Andy, is our net promoter score hovers around 96%. Wow. And when we look at a net promoter score of 96% in a service-based industry that deals with people, is really an impressive number. And honestly, I have to give all of the credit back to our team. And that's because they're the ones day to day that are finding commonality, building trust and rapport to ultimately create relationships and partnerships that last. This business and industry as a whole can become very transactional. And that is one of the things that Betsy and I have been very adamant about, that our industry and how we operate need to be viewed completely different. And we'd rather take a short-term loss to create a long-term win, not only with a candidate, but also with a client. And ultimately, the validation in that is our return customers, our candidates and clients that come back to Tier4 Group, because they know that from a service perspective, there is transparency. And what we want to do is help them solve their problems. And that's what really, if you look at staffing as a whole, across our industry, the underlying purpose of our industry is to help organizations solve talent gaps. And so that's something that we honestly work every day. We like to say we ruthlessly prioritize those things that are most important daily, and getting that 1% better on the day, to help our clients and help our candidates. And that's one of the things about this industry that has always kept me coming back, Andy, is that there is fulfillment in it. There's fulfillment in changing careers, changing lives, changing organizations and the direction of those organizations because of the talent that they can acquire. And then the other side of that is we get paid to do it. And that's a beautiful aspect of it, right?
Yes, I love it. So one of the things that excited me about having you as a guest is you bring a passion area, some experience to your role at Tier4 and some of the other things that you do around immigration. And I think, we're in this kind of interesting kind of time period now where the job market and kind of openings and stuff, even before 2025, there was a lot of volatility, and now there's seemingly even more. So what's,
Mm-hmm.
as you wear your different hats, and we'll kind of delve into your personal
Mm-hmm.
passion stuff in the H1B
Yeah.
guy bit in just a second, but from a tier 4 lens, like,
Mm-hmm.
how are you guys looking at the market and
Mm-hmm.
opportunities and managing your way? We talked about the technology stack side of it and maintaining the people side, but now you've got that in place. How are you guys driving through and
Yeah.
evaluating and looking at opportunities in the marketplace?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would start with being intentional with who our ideal customer and our ideal candidates are, and those verticals that they operate in. So we're really intentional about. We do financial services technology, we do insurance technology, supply chain manufacturing, healthcare, and e-commerce and retail. That's what we do. Not that we don't have clients that we support that are outside of those industry verticals, but that's where our subject matter expertise comes into play. Those are the pools that we draw from on a daily basis. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think what we've decided collectively as an organization is to get very intentional with not only our verticals, but then our locations to which we support within those verticals. And as we evolve with the market, it becomes a matter of diversification across the portfolio. And what
Mm-hmm.
I mean by that is um, Tier4 Group, as it started out, was primarily a boutique business, meaning most of the work that Tier4 Group did pre 2021 was on the perm direct hire.
Mm-hmm.
So over the last 4 years, we've been very intentional in creating a fairly even split between our what I would refer to as our boutique perm direct hire initiatives, and then our contingent temporary staffing that falls within more of the mid market to enterprise level organizations. And so creating that diversification across the two, Betsy and I have a saying where we like to say, we're creating a staffing firm that is pandemic proof. And now that term could be a staffing firm that is recession proof. And the reason for that is how important that contingent aspect is to our business.
Well, and I think that's a great insight. And I want to double click on that a little bit because I think there are some nuances in here. I think also coming off of the pandemic
Mm-hmm.
that has been seemingly very deliberate and
Mm-hmm.
focused for you all. And you talked about kind of this, you know, this focus and being intentional. But I think from whether it's direct hire and contingent, but then I think it's also, I'd argue, in the verticals that you're playing in, that
Mm-hmm.
you've added and created a larger portfolio. So it's not,
Mm-hmm.
you've in essence insulated yourselves
Mm-hmm.
from any volatility in any one particular vertical. So
Yeah.
you've got some variety there,
Mm-hmm.
and you've got the variety of direct hire and contingent. So
Mm-hmm.
it's you've created a little bit of a matrixed organization.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the what was really fascinating from listening to you talk about it is that even though you've developed this, larger portfolio or diversified approach,
Mm-hmm.
you still understand here's where we want to play,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to stay still laser focused on those areas and not
Mm-hmm.
continuing to potentially dilute yourselves too
Mm-hmm.
far so that you're nothing to anyone and you can't
Yeah.
deliver on your value proposition. So
Yeah.
has that been a strategic focus, or how did you evolve to this point?
Yeah. I think it's really both strategic and organic. And I would say strategic in the sense that holistically, when we look at it, we realize the things that we do really well. And we also realize where there's opportunities within those verticals that we have had a lot of success with. The organic component is really following our customer and client where they are too. And so that's created an opportunity from a territory geography space where Atlanta was where we were founded, where a large percentage of our customer base existed pre 2021. But now when we look at our geographies as a whole in Atlanta as a percentage of that, it's created, kind of to your point, a diversification across our portfolio. And ultimately, that's where the organic play has come in.
Okay. So are you, in essence, drafting geographically off the relationships with your clients, but is that also taking you into other verticals or like,
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Because I think for
it
a lot
has.
okay. Because I think for a lot of folks, it's okay. I'd like, I'm really good. I've got a sweet spot in this particular vertical or this particular geography, but what do I add next? What bet do I place? How do I, if I want to be or aspire to be like a tier 4 group, what's the next thing? Where do I put my time and energy and what bet do I play?
When you asked me that question, there was something that came to mind immediately. And this is, in our industry, one of the hardest things to do, Andy, is tell prospects or clients no. In this industry, we want to say yes to everything and everybody. And that's something for us that we've realized in the last few years is that not all clients and candidates are created equal. And ultimately, our leverage in terms of taking on what we deem as the right business is our ability to say no. And I think that's something that in a shifting market, as you alluded to at the beginning of the question, can create really opportunities for you to say yes because you're in a situation where the no maybe hurts more than the yes does.
Hey, everyone. I hope you're enjoying this episode. And if you like what we're doing here at Now Hiring, I invite you to check out our newsletter, also called Now Hiring. You can find registration for that at seeple.com. And now back to our episode. So have you developed a process for saying no? Like, does it go up the chain and somebody gets to play the no card? And then how do you what does that look like?
Yeah. I will have to tell you that this is something that I know Betsy has worked, Betsy Robinson, our CEO, has worked very, very diligently on. And it's following a framework, a framework with an if-then. And sticking to that if-then framework becomes key, because if the if is no, then the then is no, right? Those two things go hand in hand. And so, look, there's a lot of different sales frameworks that exist out there. We follow Medic is the one that we utilize and leverage. And I think if you are intentional about what your ideal client profile is, your ideal candidate profile, and you have those if-thens with the flow charts related to, it makes it easier to make that decision quickly.
Yeah.
Because the longer that you dwell on it and the more that you allow it to, what we like to say, kind of fester, if you will, the more difficult it is to say no.
Yeah. Well, it strikes me that having a framework in place, and I imagine the first couple times saying no was a challenge. But now that there's a framework or you've adopted, this what if and kind of more of a scenario plan side of it, there's some comfort level in it and there's some consistency in we're saying no for the right reasons. And so you, in essence, there's going to be some natural remorse, but it helps you kind of navigate through it and stay consistent. We said no to this for this reason. So the next time this type of option or situation comes up, we need to stay consistent with that unless other things around it have changed.
Yeah, it's the justification, right? And it allows reason to take over. And I think when we look at, I had an analogy of 2022 in our industry was an account executive in the staffing industry in 2022 could open their front door and catch 10 job orders. But a recruiter in 2022 could walk around their entire neighborhood, bang on every door and ask every one of their neighbors, and that would all be, no, I'm not interested. And we've seen a swing go from the other side of, if we look at 2024 data and what that looked like compared to 2022, it was the opposite. You could open your front door and you had 10 neighbors lined up looking for opportunities, but you could walk around the entire neighborhood asking if anyone's hiring, and no one was. Yeah. Why? Because of economic shifts, market conditions, and factors. And when we look at, there was a talent acquisition race that happened in 2022 where there was a lot of remote hiring that took place. And as we've seen the return to office trend go from 1 to 2 days to 3 to 4 days now is the norm, we've also realized that most professionals are looking for some sort of hybrid type arrangement. Mm-hmm. And the data tells us that number's around 60%, which is really crazy if you think about how quickly that's happened in the last 18 to 24 months, where folks would not even consider a hybrid type arrangement. But now the data tells us that it's 60% of candidates are looking for a hybrid type arrangement where they have a couple of days in office, but then the flexibility to have a work from home remote office setup mm-hmm. as well.
Yeah, I think some of it is the realization that as an employee, we are less in control mm-hmm. of the situation, but as an employer, mm-hmm. The other side of it is it's hard to put the remote piece back in the bottle mm-hmm. because, through the pandemic, that was the norm. And we got used to some of those ways of life. And so there's benefits to each side. And
there is.
And I think, the next several years are going to be interesting in terms of what that looks and feels like.
And I think employers that are getting it right are offering the right blend for the individual mm-hmm. based on the need of the role and the responsibilities. And I think that solution or what that policy or best practice looks like varies depending on the organization, the location, and the individual specifically, and that team collaboration that has become so important. The other shift that we've seen in our industry as a whole is the amount of in-person that's taking place. If we go back just a couple of years, we look at all of the events that are happening and all of the user groups and meetings, and those things are really back to what I would call 2019 era happenings. That to me is, in the last 6 months, we've seen that just dramatically change, where the in-person, being out in front and being out in the community is key. And if you're not doing that, you're missing out on opportunities. And I think that, along with the return to office, really has been a dramatic shift, Andy, in the last 12 months.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, staffing is, versus a lot of other industries, is so heavily influenced by macro and microeconomics. Mm-hmm. We've already talked about technology. We've talked about kind of the relationship between employer and employee, mm-hmm. and remote and hybrid work. I think the other kind of component that comes into play is the globalization of industry and the workforce. Mm-hmm. And this is my way of delving into immigration. And immigration has fueled a lot of those job opportunities before. Mm-hmm. And now, we're seeing some shifts in terms of immigration policies, not only in the U.S., but in other countries around the globe, mm-hmm. as economies are trying to adjust to this post-pandemic mm-hmm. world and marketplace. So what are you seeing, putting your immigration, your H1B guy hat on, mm-hmm. What are you seeing in the crystal ball?
The war on talent globally has never been at a higher level than it is today. And if we go back and look at the data specifically around birth rates, 1.9% across the population here in the United States, and what that means. We look at the aging population of the workforce. We look at the male demographic number, that male demographic number between 22 and 32 that isn't working. And when we look at where those gaps currently exist and how are we going to continue to lead innovation and the technology arms race that we've prided ourselves on as a country since our founding, comes back to immigration as a solution. It's not the only solution for that, but it is one of the primary ways for us to go about identifying and winning that war on talent, is to create opportunities and pipelines from a global perspective. We look at the emerging economies that exist, countries like India and China that have the highest population rates in the world, but also looking at their advancements in technology, their advancements in education, and how that, when we peel it back and look at how we compete here in the United States, we still are the number one destination globally in the world for advanced education. In order for us to continue to be that, we have got to identify and offer pathways that lead to work authorization here in the US. There are a few avenues that currently exist, but those avenues that currently exist, most of which are built on laws that were written in 1990.
Wow.
If we think about technology in 1990 and compare that to technology of 2025, two completely different entities, right, Andy?
Yes.
So I think when we look at what does the current immigration system look like as it relates to high skilled employment-based immigration, there are a lot of areas of opportunity for us to improve the system that currently exists. It's very prohibitive.
Yeah. So is a solution monetizing that?
Yeah, that's a great question. My answer on that is no. And, I'm assuming you're asking that question based on...
I'm leading into a gold card question.
Yeah, the gold card news, right? So I launched the H1B Guy.com and the H1B Guy YouTube channel on June 29th of 2020.
Okay.
And when I launched the platform, I had identified that most folks that were talking about high-skilled employment-based immigration were immigration attorneys or they were immigrants themselves. And my background has been in technology, recruiting, and staffing, and I built and managed a very large immigration program for a large staffing firm here in Atlanta. And through that, became a subject matter expert in H1B visas and other work authorization statuses. Through all of that, I gained exposure to the green card backlog. And for those who aren't familiar with what the green card backlog is, there are caps based on country of birth for employment-based preferences. Each year, 140,000 employment-based green cards are issued in the United States to individuals who are sponsored by an employer, or there are some that can self-sponsor from an employment-based perspective. But I won't muddy that waters, but know that there is a 7% cap that is put on country of origin. And when we look at international students as a whole, India and China lead that in terms of the percentage of individuals that come to the U.S. to get their U.S. master's degree or higher. They're the highest percentage. The demographics for international students or India and China lead that race. They also make up a little under 90% of the total number of H1B visas that are issued annually through the H1B lottery. And so because of those two aspects, when you look at employment-based green cards, which is there are 3 steps to the employment-based green card sponsorship, perm labor certification being the first of those steps. Ultimately, if you are an individual from India or China, and you're looking at, there's 4 different categories within employment-based preferences, EB1, EB2, EB3, and EB4. The majority of individuals fall in either EB2 or EB3 from an employment-based sponsorship perspective. And we look at wait times for individuals from India specifically, 15 to 20 years, Andy.
Wow.
we're talking about. The individuals in the green card backlog have to wait in order for their date to become current. Their date meaning their date that their perm labor was filed and
Okay.
subsequently certified. And so I share all of this because ultimately what happens is those individuals are living and working in the US on an H1B visa. And it is restrictive in the sense that they are tied specifically to their employer. And some of these individuals have lived and worked in the US 10, 12 years and are still waiting in the green card backlog. Their children have aged out of their dependency status, and it's created another gap, which is referred to as documented dreamers. And ultimately, that is a talent gap to where we're losing out on as well, because we're telling kids that were brought here as legal immigrants that are U.S. educated that they no longer have authorization to live in the U.S.
Yeah, these are not in essence short-term stints, but these are individuals who have come and built careers and lives and livelihood, have had families, homes, built communities.
That's right. They're your neighbor. They're my neighbor. And I think that the biggest thing, Andy, that the average American like you and I thinks that immigrants on work visas go to the DMV to renew their visa. And that's not the case. It's very complex. It's very complicated. It's very expensive from a legal and filing fee perspective, not only having an immigration attorney, but also the filing fees for the government as a whole. And, as of the time of this recording, we're on the back end of the H1B lottery for fiscal year 2026 closing, which closed back on March 24th. Selection notifications started and went out around March 28th and continued through March 31st. And the H1B portal, application portal, is now open and will run through June 30th. USCIS raised the filing fee to $215, the registration fee to $215 per individual this year. But still, demand seems to be relatively high. I've not seen final numbers. I've speculated that there would be somewhere around 400,000 registrations this year. Some of what I'm hearing is that number is going to be significantly less. I think they're expecting it to be somewhere under 300,000 actually. But I think that's because when you look at a $215 non-refundable fee with no guarantee of selection for 85,000 available visas. 85,000 H1B visas that are made available each year, 60,000 for individuals with an international advanced degree, and then another 20,000 that have a U.S. master's or higher. So when you look at the total pool and the probability, it's extremely low, 18 to 20% selection probability.
And like, how many of us would go and spend $215 on a lottery ticket that has no option for winning, let alone whatever, the Mega Millions or Powerball,
or a 20% chance of winning, right? And if that 20% chance it is to occur, I've had this saying that, look, the value of an H1B visa has never been higher. And so to bring it full circle back to the gold card question, that's why when you look at what was put out, ultimately offering 1,000 gold cards at $5 million per, the value of that is extremely high. And I think what that ultimately starts to create, though, Andy, which is a very dangerous and slippery slope for us when we look at our immigration policies and immigration reform as a whole, is it's creating a pay-to-play system.
Well, that's where I was going with it. Because, so the gold card, my understanding is the gold card is for, you talked about the different EB levels, and the gold card comes in at an EB5, which you did not mention. So that's kind of reserved for fast tracking, especially given the price tag on it. But it's you're talking rare air, but and a lot of exclusivity there. But if that's what's coming in at this EB5 kind of investor level, then does it have the potential? Let's say it works and policy takes takes time, but maybe there's a way to kind of accelerate some things and opening up Pandora's box on the pay to play. But does that cascade down? Is there a price tag on an EB4, a 3, a 2, a 1 that it's less of a random lottery, or does it help normalize and solve the issue, or in your mind does it create more risk and chaos to the system?
Yeah, I think what it immediately does is monetizes U.S. residency. And that ultimately, to me, is a very slippery slope when we talk about monetizing U.S. residency versus creating a pathway for skilled-based immigration. And when we look at what employment-based preferences are intended to follow, are the best and brightest. And in order for us to continue to attract the best and brightest, monetizing U.S. residency, to me, is not the path for success. Now, is there an opportunity, as you mentioned, the EB5 investor visa, when we talk about gold cards at $5 million per, I would assume that individuals that have the liquidity to be able to afford a visa or a gold card at that range have some sort of entrepreneurial or investment background. But I think the difference between those two, Andy, is that we are commoditizing a visa or residency versus it being a privilege.
Well, and I think, yes, agree with you. And I think an important piece that we have not brought into this part of the conversation, but we've talked about earlier, is the global economy. And you mentioned birth rates and stuff, and you touched on kind of the U.S. and the birth rate here, but birth rates globally are also in decline. And so, trying to commoditize or put a dollar value on U.S. residency or citizenship, it sets aside or ignores the challenges that other countries and other regions are having in terms of their own demographics. And so now it's where do I want to live? Where do I want to pay to participate? And now you've got this, there's not a single economy of residency, but there's you potentially have other countries, other regions kind of trying to monetize their own, and you've exponentially exploded this thing.
Right. Yeah. I go back to like the nomad visas that exist in Central and South America, which are really intended for the nomad tech worker. Not only the nomad US tech worker, but the global nomad tech worker. And so quality of life is key. And the thing about our immigration system, when we look at how H1Bs are issued annually, how they are restricted to a limit of years, 6 years total, and unless there is employment-based green card sponsorship that allows them to then extend their time, we don't make it easy for high-skilled immigrants to establish their roots as it already exists. And ultimately, it creates this, like I said, the difference between monetization and privilege, the commodity and the privilege aspect to it. And so for me, what I would love to see is a cleaner pathway for international students who come to the U.S., who are U.S. educated. President Trump hit on this earlier in the election cycle, pre-election cycle, where he talked about establishing employment authorization documents for those that do have a U.S. master's or higher. And one of the things that I've talked about a lot in my reform recommendations is creating what I'd call an H1B EAD, which is for individuals who are U.S. educated, who do graduate, and then identify opportunities where they are working in a perm full-time capacity that then give them a pathway to longer-term residency. Because what happens right now when we look at the way OPT and OPT STEM work is that it's a very finite period of time between 12 to 36 months, depending on the type of degree that those individuals obtain. And once that period of time is up, if they have not identified a sponsor, if they were not selected in the H1B lottery, we give them a wave and tell them, see you later. And I think, to me, when we look at talent gaps that exist and the talent that we're allowing to come into our country that we are educating, but then we're turning our backs on and saying, but you can't stay here.
Yeah. Well, it's the equivalent would be if you're a new hire and I spent time and energy training you to do your job. And then as soon as you finish the onboarding, bye-bye.
Yeah. Yeah.
And letting my time and energy and you walk out the door. That's an interesting challenge. So we've been talking about immigration kind of at the 50,000 foot level, and we went really deep on this. What I'd like to do is kind of bring it back to, firms like Tier4 or others in the space where they may or may not have somebody like you on staff that understands immigration and the challenges and stuff. What should those types of firms? How should they be thinking about immigration? What should they be doing to on a day-to-day basis to kind of stay abreast of what's going on?
I met with a client a few weeks ago, and they asked me a very similar question. And my response to them was a question in return. And it was quite simply, you have to ask yourself, is the cost of acquisition or the cost of losing this individual greater than the cost to do a new recruitment? And ultimately, it comes down to if you are going to pursue work visas, H1B specifically, as an avenue to do staff augmentation, because you can't identify talent that already exists, you need to do a cost analysis. And that cost analysis is not just your legal and filing fees, Andy. It's the time spent where maybe that individual is not working, the time spent in the recruitment that exists, and then the time spent, as you mentioned, onboarding and training that individual and getting them up to speed. So it's time and money. There is an analysis that has to take place. And if you are an organization, whether it be a staffing firm or an employer, and you're looking at really what is the overall cost analysis, not only just from a true monetary expense, but also from a time expense, and you look at those two things, if it is justified for you to create a sponsorship opportunity, then that would be where I would advise you to seek legal representation. And you need to have an excellent immigration attorney. While I may be an immigration expert, I am not an attorney, and I don't pretend to be one. And I am very adamant about, I help employers and individuals solve complex work authorization issues in the recruitment process. But a legal representative helps you with the documentation and the legal and filings of those. And if you need a representative, because one of the things I can tell you is that if you get into this space, the government will come looking and they will do their audits. They will do their site checks, and you need to have everything above board. And if you cannot, or that is not something that's feasible or possible for you in terms of justifying the recruitment of the individual, justifying the cost and the legal prevailing wages that go into employing an individual on a work visa, then don't consider it.
Got it. Great advice, great guidance. And I think, Robert, you've shared with us today a bunch of insights, not only in terms of how to think about tech stacks, but also, how to say no, how to navigate immigration and H1B sides of things. And you've really helped unpack what the current landscape is. So thank you for that. And one more question for you, kind of a little bit lighter in tone, but what's the most important book that you've ever read?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think for me, it's evolved over time. But I have to give my sister-in-law some credit here, as She gave my wife a book, and the name of the book is Subtle Art of Not Giving a Bleep. And I read that in 2020 when the world was really crazy, and it changed my mindset on a lot of things. And ultimately, I have a saying here in our environment, and it's we have to control what we can control. And ultimately, I control my attitude and my activity or my effort. And I think when I peel it back to that book as a reference guide 4+ years ago now, it really had an impact on me. He has a blog, and I know that there's been a movie put out. I've not seen the movie, but I've read the book 2 times now in the last couple of years. And I think it just comes back to understanding who I am, and really the pursuit of trying to leave this industry, the staffing industry as a whole, better than I found it. I've worked for and with a lot of great people in my journey in this business, going back now, I hate to say it, almost 18 years I've been in this industry. Actually, more than that, if I go back to my pre-staffing firm days of where I was recruiting for a technology-based company. A lot has changed in that time, Andy, but I think I come back to knowing who I am and what I'm looking to accomplish, and how I do that through my platform and my people.
Awesome. I love that. I love that answer. And I having read the book, I think it's a great recommendation for our audience. And I think I love how it also, we've talked about saying no, and now we've talked about, how to not give an F. And I think it's kind of a great kind of synthesis of our conversation today. So Robert, thank you for your time and the wonderful conversation. And everyone, please connect with Robert on LinkedIn or through the H1B Guy or at Tier4 Group. And until next time, we're now hiring.